By the time Don stepped out of the cab on Madison Avenue, New York had already decided who he was. The city was still waking up, steel towers catching early light, sidewalks humming with purpose, but Don barely noticed. He stood for a moment with one hand on the handle of his worn suitcase, staring up at the glass building in front of him. 47 floors, clean lines, power carved into architecture. The name Push Global Holdings was etched in brushed silver above the revolving doors. This was not where men like him were supposed to begin. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Don had arrived in New York with ambition sharpened by years of quiet hunger and a past he kept sealed tight. He was young, yes, but not naive. He had learned early that the world listened more closely to confidence than to truth. So he straightened his shoulders, smoothed his jacket, and walked inside like he belonged. Less than 30 seconds later, Rebecca Push crossed the lobby. She did not rush. She never did. Rebecca Push moved with the ease of someone who had earned her space in every room she entered. At 46, she was everything business magazines loved to mythologize: self-made billionaire, ruthless negotiator, elegant without effort. Her presence shifted the air. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. Don noticed her immediately, not because of the money or the reputation, but because she looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Their eyes met briefly as her assistant murmured something at her side. It was a passing glance, nothing dramatic, but something about the way Rebecca looked at him, curious without judgment, made Don hold his breath for half a second longer than necessary. That was all it took. Within a week, Don was seen entering her building twice. By the second week, he was leaving with her driver. By the third, someone took a photo. The rumor did the rest. New York loved a story it could reduce to one sentence, and this one was simple: young man, older billionaire woman, obvious arrangement. People didn't ask how Don had ended up there. They didn't ask why Rebecca Push, who could have anyone, kept him close. They didn't ask questions at all. They assumed answers. In cafes near Wall Street, whispers followed his name. On gossip blogs, anonymous sources smirked behind keyboards. Another pretty boy secured the bag. Rebecca Push's new accessory: AgeGapLoveStory or paid companionship. Don saw the headlines late at night, phone glowing in the dark of his small rented room in Brooklyn. He never clicked the articles. He didn't need to. He knew how the story ended. He had seen versions of it play out his whole life. People like him were never allowed complexity. What no one knew was that Don had not come looking for a benefactor. He had come looking for a door. Rebecca Push, on the other hand, had spent years perfecting the art of being untouchable. She had learned to keep men at a distance, not because she lacked desire, but because she lacked patience for illusions. Power changed the shape of affection. It made people flatter, pretend, perform. Don did none of those things. When he spoke, it was measured. When he listened, it was complete. He didn't linger where he wasn't invited, and he didn't look at her like she owed him anything, not even attention. That alone made him different. Still, Rebecca was not blind to perception. She understood optics better than most. She had built an empire by controlling narratives before they controlled her. Yet this time, she chose silence. At a private dinner with investors, someone laughed lightly and asked if she planned to bring her boyfriend next time. Rebecca didn't smile. She didn't correct them either. She simply took a sip of her wine and redirected the conversation to quarterly projections. To the world, that silence was confirmation. Don became a rumor with legs. In elevators, people glanced at him too long. In restaurants, he noticed the shift when Rebecca arrived and he stood beside her, not ahead, not behind, always beside. Staff smiled politely, but the assumption sat heavy in the air. He felt it most when he was alone. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood on a grand scale. Don carried it quietly. He reminded himself why he was here. He reminded himself of nights spent working double shifts, of promises made to no one but himself, of the vow he had taken never to beg, not for money, not for love, not for legitimacy. Rebecca Push was not his savior. She was his opportunity. But even opportunities came with consequences. One afternoon, as they exited a black SUV outside a midtown conference center, a photographer called out Rebecca's name. Dawn instinctively stepped back, giving her space. The camera clicked anyway. The image that circulated later showed him half a step behind her, jaw tight, eyes forward. The caption read, "Rebecca Push and her much younger companion." Don stared at the photo for a long time before locking his phone. He wondered, not for the first time, if ambition always came at the cost of dignity, or if this was simply the price he had to pay to reach the table. Across the city, Rebecca sat alone in her penthouse office long after sunset, reviewing reports she already knew by heart. The skyline glittered beyond the windows, but she wasn't looking at it. She was thinking about the young man everyone thought they understood. She knew the rumors, she always did, but something in her resisted correcting them. Perhaps because, for once, the truth felt like it belonged only to her. And Don, standing at the edge of a city that had already decided his role, had no idea that this was only the beginning of a story that would cost them both far more than reputation. It was the rumor everyone believed, and the truth no one had asked for yet. Before the world learned to say her name with awe, Rebecca Push learned how to survive without mercy. She had not been born into wealth, nor into comfort. Her childhood had been defined by narrow hallways, unpaid bills, and a mother who taught resilience the hard way, by never letting Rebecca see fear even when it lived in their kitchen cupboards. Long before Rebecca ever signed a contract worth millions, she learned how to calculate risk, how to read people, and how to stay standing when disappointment tried to pull her under. By 35, she had built something rare. By 40, she had built something unstoppable. Push Global Holdings was not just a company, it was a declaration. Rebecca had entered a male-dominated industry and rewritten the rules quietly without begging for approval. She didn't shout to be heard. She spoke once and people leaned in. She didn't dominate rooms, she commanded them. Yet power had a way of isolating those who carried it. Rebecca's days were filled with meetings that never ended, flights that blurred into one another, and negotiations where no one dared waste her time with honesty. Men pursued her for proximity. Women admired her from a distance. Everyone wanted something. No one ever asked how she felt. Loneliness crept in slowly, disguised as independence. It hid behind productivity, behind champagne glasses raised at galas, behind applause that followed her name. Rebecca had convinced herself that solitude was a fair trade for success. Until Don entered her orbit. Their first real conversation did not happen in a boardroom or a luxury car. It happened in a quiet corner of her office after everyone else had left. The city outside glowed, but inside, the atmosphere was unexpectedly calm. Don spoke without rehearsing. He didn't oversell himself. He didn't compliment her unnecessarily. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight because they weren't rushed. Rebecca noticed that. She also noticed what he didn't do. He didn't stare at the artwork lining her walls. He didn't comment on the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't ask how it felt to be a billionaire. He treated her like a person whose time mattered, not a monument to admire. That unsettled her. Rebecca was used to control. She had mastered emotional distance so thoroughly that intimacy felt foreign, even intrusive. Yet Don's presence didn't demand space. It earned it quietly. Over the next few weeks, their interactions multiplied. Brief exchanges became longer discussions. Formal meetings softened into thoughtful conversations. Rebecca found herself asking Don questions she rarely asked anyone, about his thinking, his goals, his perspective on work and purpose. What surprised her most was how easily she spoke around him. She didn't need to perform brilliance. She didn't need to sharpen her tone. Don never interrupted her, never corrected her, never tried to impress her with borrowed confidence. He absorbed information carefully, responded thoughtfully, and disagreed respectfully when he did. Rebecca had spent years surrounded by people who either feared her or flattered her. Don did neither. Still, she kept her guard intact. At home, Rebecca lived alone in a penthouse that echoed more than it should have. The space was immaculate, tastefully designed, and emotionally vacant. She often worked late simply to avoid sitting in silence with thoughts she refused to name. Sometimes, she caught herself wondering what Don was doing at that hour. The realization unsettled her enough that she dismissed it immediately. This was not longing, she told herself. It was curiosity, professional interest, nothing more. But even she couldn't deny the shift. At a charity gala, Rebecca stood surrounded by familiar faces, politicians, executives, socialites, all smiling with practiced ease. Don stood nearby, unobtrusive yet present. When someone made a joke at her expense, Rebecca stiffened instinctively, ready with a response sharp enough to end the conversation. Don spoke before she did. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply firm, clear enough to draw a boundary, calm enough to maintain dignity. The moment passed, but Rebecca felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. Protection. No one had done that for her in years. Later that night, as the car carried them through the city, Rebecca stared out the window, watching reflections distort against glass. Don sat quietly, sensing her mood without needing explanation. "You didn't have to do that," she said eventually. "I know," he replied. The simplicity of his answer lingered. Rebecca realized then that Don didn't see her as untouchable. He didn't approach her like a fortress to be admired from afar. He saw her as someone human enough to deserve consideration. That scared her more than gossip ever could. She had built her life on certainty, on predictability, on control. Don introduced variables she had no spreadsheet for. His presence disrupted routines she had relied on for years. And yet she didn't ask him to leave. Rebecca Push was a woman the world believed it understood. Billionaire, powerful, cold, untouchable. But beneath the polished image was someone who had learned to survive alone, and was quietly realizing how heavy that survival had become. Don didn't rescue her. He simply reminded her that she was still capable of wanting more than solitude. And somewhere between meetings and midnight conversations, Rebecca began to understand that the greatest risk she had ever faced was not financial, professional, or public. It was emotional. And she had no idea how much it would cost her to open that door. Rebecca Push believed in structure. Every success she had ever earned could be traced back to one principle: nothing meaningful survived without boundaries. Contracts protected intentions. Agreements preserved clarity. Lines, once drawn, kept chaos at bay. That belief was the reason Don found himself seated across from her, in a private conference room, one quiet morning, a thin folder placed neatly between them. Outside the glass walls, Push Global Holdings pulsed with activity. Assistants moved briskly, phones rang, screens glowed with figures that shifted markets. Inside the room, however, there was an unusual stillness. Rebecca had dismissed everyone else. This conversation required no audience. She folded her hands on the table, posture composed, expression neutral. Don noticed the difference immediately. This was not the Rebecca who listened over coffee or asked thoughtful questions late in the evening. This was the executive who made decisions that altered lives. "I'm offering you a position," she said, voice steady. "Not a favor, not a shortcut, a real opportunity." Don didn't respond right away. He scanned the folder without touching it, eyes sharp, attentive. He had learned long ago that the first response often revealed more than silence ever could. "What kind of position?" he asked finally. "Strategic development," Rebecca replied. "You work directly under my oversight. It's demanding, it's visible, and it will put you in rooms most people never enter." She paused, allowing the weight of that truth to settle. "There are expectations," she continued. "Professional conduct, discretion, absolute clarity about roles." Don met her gaze. There was no eagerness in his expression, no hunger to grab what was being offered. Instead, there was caution. "And compensation?" he asked. Rebecca named a figure. It was generous without being indulgent. Enough to change his circumstances, not enough to buy silence or loyalty. Don nodded once. "I want it clear," he said. "I'm not here because of proximity. I don't want assumptions attached to my work." Rebecca exhaled quietly, something close to relief crossing her face before she masked it again. "Neither do I." That was how it began, not with attraction, not with promises, but with clarity. They shook hands across the table, no lingering touch, no unspoken suggestion, just two people agreeing to build something defined. Yet even as Don stepped into his new role, both of them sensed the fragility of what they were attempting. Work placed them closer than either had anticipated. Strategy sessions stretched longer than scheduled. Travel brought unfamiliar intimacy, long flights, shared silences, conversations that drifted beyond professional limits without crossing them. Rebecca tested Don constantly, though she never acknowledged it. She pushed him into difficult discussions, challenged his thinking, forced him to defend his ideas in rooms full of skepticism. Don met every challenge with composure. He didn't shrink. He didn't overcompensate. He adapted. What unsettled Rebecca was not his competence, it was his restraint. He never leaned on familiarity, never used access as leverage, never blurred lines for advantage. In a world where people reached for power however they could, Don seemed determined to earn his place without shortcuts. The unspoken contract between them grew heavier with each passing day. Rebecca found herself noticing details she had trained herself to ignore. The way Don's focus sharpened when he was challenged. The way he absorbed criticism without defensiveness. The quiet confidence he carried when others tried to undermine him. At night, alone in her apartment, she replayed conversations she hadn't meant to remember. Don, for his part, wrestled with contradictions he hadn't prepared for. He admired Rebecca's mind more than her success, her indicate judgment more than her authority. Yet admiration was dangerous. It softened edges that needed to remain sharp. He reminded himself constantly, this was work. This was opportunity, anything else was distraction. Still, moments slipped through defenses. One evening, after a particularly brutal negotiation, Rebecca sat back in her chair, eyes closed briefly, exhaustion etched into her features. Don watched her from across the room, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he said before thinking. Rebecca opened her eyes slowly. The room felt smaller suddenly. "That's not how this works," she replied. "Maybe it should," Don said quietly. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was charged. Rebecca stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll continue tomorrow," she said, voice controlled. Don gathered his notes and left without argument. He understood dismissal when he heard it. Later that night, Rebecca poured herself a glass of wine she didn't finish. She stood by the window, city lights stretching endlessly below, and confronted a truth she didn't want to name. The contract she had written, clear, professional, contained, was beginning to fail her. There were rules neither of them had spoken aloud. No touching, no personal dependency, no emotional entanglement. Yet emotion, like water, found its way through cracks no one admitted existed. Rebecca had built her life on logic, yet something about Don defied calculation. He didn't chase her. He didn't retreat either. He simply existed within her space with integrity. That was the most dangerous thing of all. The following weeks tested them further. External pressure intensified. Gossip sharpened. Every interaction was scrutinized. Rebecca remained composed publicly, but privately she felt the strain. Don noticed. He always noticed. He adjusted without being asked. He created distance in meetings, kept conversations concise, removed opportunities for misinterpretation. The effort was visible and painful. Rebecca recognized it instantly. The unspoken agreement had changed again. One night, as they stood waiting for an elevator after a late meeting, Rebecca broke the silence. "You're pulling away," she said. Don didn't deny it. "I need to protect the work." "And yourself?" "Yes," he replied. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside, standing far enough apart to satisfy appearances. Close enough to feel tension hum between them. Rebecca looked at him then, not as an executive, not as a billionaire, but as a woman confronting something she had never planned for. "We can't afford mistakes," she said softly. Don met her gaze, expression steady but eyes dark with resolve. "Then we should stop pretending this is simple." The elevator doors closed. Neither of them spoke again. That night marked the end of the illusion that their connection could be contained by paperwork and professionalism. The contract they had never written, the one governing emotion, intention, restraint, was unraveling. And both of them knew it. The shift between them was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the way night settles over a city without announcing itself. There was no single moment where Rebecca Push decided to let Don closer, no dramatic confession or emotional collapse. Instead, trust arrived quietly, disguised as routine. It began with time. Not the scheduled, guarded hours marked by calendars and agendas, but the moments that slipped through cracks. Late evenings when meetings ran long and neither felt the urge to leave. Early mornings when coffee turned into conversation before assistants arrived. The formality that once defined their interactions softened, not by intention, but by familiarity. Rebecca found herself exhaling around Don in a way she didn't around anyone else. In the presence of board members, she was precise. With investors, she was strategic. In public, she was immaculate, but with Don, something loosened. She spoke without editing every sentence. She allowed pauses without rushing to fill them. She admitted uncertainty without fearing it would be mistaken for weakness. That alone unsettled her. One night they worked from her office well past midnight. The city outside had quieted, traffic thinning, lights dimming in surrounding buildings. Rebecca removed her heels and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples with a sigh she hadn't meant to release. Don noticed immediately. "You don't stop," he said, not as criticism but as observation. Rebecca opened her eyes slowly. "If I stop, everything catches up." Don didn't press her. He simply nodded, as though he understood more than she'd said. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the building. Eventually, Rebecca spoke again, surprising herself. "Do you know what people never tell you about winning?" she asked. Don looked up from his notes. "What?" "It doesn't end," she said. "There's no moment where someone says, 'That's enough now, you can rest.'" Don considered her words carefully. "That sounds lonely." Rebecca almost laughed, almost. She wasn't used to having her inner world reflected so plainly. Most people avoided naming what they sensed in her. Don didn't. From that night on, their conversations shifted. They still discussed work, strategy, and decisions, but woven between those topics were fragments of something deeper. Rebecca spoke about her early failures, about nights she slept in her office, about deals she lost that hardened her more than success ever could. Don listened without interrupting, without pity, without awe. In return, he allowed pieces of himself to surface, not the full story, not yet, but enough to reveal shape. He spoke about ambition forged from absence, about learning early that no one would rescue him, about the quiet pressure of having to prove worth again and again. Rebecca didn't ask questions that pried. She let him share at his pace. That restraint mattered more than curiosity. Trust grew not from revelation, but from respect. Their environment changed too. Meetings moved from conference rooms to private lounges. Flights included shared meals instead of separate schedules. The world still watched, still whispered, but inside their shared space, something steadier took form. Rebecca noticed how Don anticipated her needs without being told. He learned her rhythms, her tells. When she needed silence, he gave it. When she needed perspective, he offered it without ego. When she doubted herself, a rare but dangerous state, he grounded her without challenging her authority. For the first time in years, Rebecca didn't feel like she was performing strength. Don, meanwhile, saw layers in Rebecca the world never glimpsed. He saw the way her shoulders slumped when she was exhausted, the way her voice softened when she spoke about things that mattered, the way she sometimes stared out windows as though searching for something she'd misplaced long ago. She wasn't cold, she was guarded. And guards grew weary. One evening, during a quiet dinner arranged out of necessity rather than indulgence, Rebecca surprised them both by asking, "Do you ever get tired of proving yourself?" Don paused, fork suspended midair. The question landed heavier than she intended. "Yes," he answered honestly, "but I don't know how to stop." Rebecca nodded, "Neither do I." That was the moment Don understood that what connected them was not imbalance, but similarity. They stood on opposite ends of life's timeline, yet carried the same burden, the expectation to always be enough. Comfort crept in where caution once ruled. Rebecca stopped monitoring her expressions so closely around him. Don stopped rehearsing his words before speaking. Their silences became shared rather than awkward. When tension surfaced, it wasn't electric, it was steady, restrained, waiting. Yet neither crossed the line. Not because the desire wasn't there, but because something more fragile was forming. Trust demanded patience. Rushing would cheapen it. Still, the world refused to look away. At a private event hosted by one of Rebecca's longtime associates, Don overheard murmurs that made his jaw tighten. He didn't react outwardly. He never did. But later, as they drove through the city, the weight of it pressed against his chest. "They talk," he said quietly. Rebecca didn't ask who, she already knew. They always will. That doesn't make it easier. She turned to look at him then, truly look at him, and something in her expression softened. "You don't owe them anything," she said. Don exhaled slowly. "Sometimes it feels like I owe everyone proof." Rebecca reached out instinctively, stopping herself just short of touching his arm. The restraint was deliberate and revealing. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," she said. The car continued forward, city lights streaking past windows, but something inside both of them shifted. For Rebecca, it was the realization that she trusted Don not just with her work, but with her unguarded self. For Don, it was the understanding that Rebecca saw him not as an extension of her world, but as someone worthy within it. Comfort had quietly transformed into trust. And trust, once established, was far more dangerous than desire, because it made the thought of loss unbearable. When they parted that night, neither said what lingered between them. They didn't need to. The unspoken truth followed them into separate spaces, settling in quietly, waiting. What they were building no longer belonged to professional definitions. And for the first time, both of them sensed how fragile and powerful that made it. The world did not care about nuance. It never had. What Rebecca and Don were building, carefully, quietly, with restraint, existed in a space too subtle for public appetite. Outsiders preferred stories that fit neatly into boxes, stories that could be digested quickly and judged without effort. And so, as their connection deepened, the noise around them grew louder, sharper, and more invasive. It began with speculation and matured into certainty. A lifestyle blog published a feature disguised as commentary, complete with carefully chosen photographs and smug phrasing. The article never accused outright, never stated facts it couldn't defend, but implication did the work. Age gap, luxury, proximity. The conclusion was obvious to anyone scrolling without thought. Other outlets followed. Social media did what it always did best: simplified, amplified, distorted. Screens filled with opinions from strangers who had never spoken to either of them yet felt entitled to verdicts. Memes circulated. Threads dissected Don's appearance, his posture, his silence. Some mocked. Others pretended concern. Very few asked questions. The label settled into place with cruel efficiency. Don noticed the shift immediately. It followed him into rooms that once felt neutral. People who had previously engaged him with professional curiosity now studied him with thinly veiled judgment. Compliments came laced with doubt. Opportunities arrived with strings attached to perception rather than merit. He remained composed, but the cost was internal. At night, he replayed conversations, analyzing whether his words had sounded too deferential, whether his presence beside Rebecca invited assumptions he could not control. He began to police himself, where he stood, how long he spoke. When he deferred, the effort was exhausting. Rebecca saw it. She pretended not to. Outwardly, she maintained her usual calm. Publicly, she behaved exactly as she always had, focused, unbothered, decisive. She refused to acknowledge gossip, refused to issue statements, refused to dignify rumors with response. To her peers, this was strength. To Don, it felt like distance. He understood her instinct. He had watched her navigate far worse storms with silence and precision. But this was different. The scrutiny wasn't aimed solely at her. It pressed into him daily, reshaping how he was seen and, worse, how he was treated. One afternoon, after a tense meeting where his contribution was dismissed with polite condescension, Don retreated to a quiet corner of the office and sat alone. He didn't check his phone. He didn't pace. He simply stared at the city below, jaw tight, shoulders squared. Rebecca found him there later. She didn't ask what was wrong. She rarely did. Instead, she spoke about logistics, about upcoming travel, about timelines. Don listened, responded where necessary, and kept his expression neutral. When she finished, silence followed. "Say it," she said finally. Don hesitated. "Say what?" "What you're not saying." He exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "I can handle pressure. I expected resistance, but being erased, being reduced, that's different." Rebecca folded her arms lightly, posture still controlled. "People will talk regardless of what we do." "I know," Don replied, "but it feels like they're talking over me, like I don't exist beyond the story they've decided on." Rebecca studied him, something unreadable passing through her gaze. "You don't need to fight narratives. You outgrow them." "That takes time," Don said, "and in the meantime this follows me everywhere." She nodded once as though filing the concern away. Let it pass. The conversation ended there. Rebecca believed distance from noise was survival. She had mastered the skill early: rise above, stay silent, remain unshaken. What she didn't realize was that Don's position in the world did not afford him the same insulation. Where she could absorb judgment without consequence, Don felt its weight directly. Every whisper threatened his credibility. Every assumption chipped at the autonomy he worked relentlessly to protect. The label clung to him like a shadow. It crept into introductions, into networking spaces, into rooms where he should have been evaluated on ability rather than proximity. He sensed it in the way conversations stalled when Rebecca wasn't present, in the way praise was qualified, in the way trust came slower. He began to pull inward. Rebecca noticed the change in cadence before she noticed the cause. Don became more formal, more reserved. He arrived early and left promptly. Conversations shortened. Laughter faded. The warmth they had built dimmed, replaced by careful distance. She assumed it was stress. She assumed it was pride. What she didn't assume was pain. The tension reached its peak at a private gathering hosted by one of Rebecca's most influential partners. It was the kind of event where reputation circulated faster than drinks, where alliances formed in subtle gestures rather than contracts. Don accompanied Rebecca as expected. He stood beside her, composed, attentive, aware of every glance thrown their way. At one point, a man Rebecca had known for years leaned in and spoke quietly, though not quietly enough. "You're generous," he said, eyes flicking toward Don. "Very." Rebecca's expression hardened instantly. "I'm intentional," she replied. The man laughed, unbothered. "Of course, as long as everyone understands the arrangement." Don heard every word. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't betray emotion, but something inside him closed, final and sharp. Later in the car, silence filled the space between them. Rebecca sensed the shift. "He was out of line," she said. Don nodded. "He said what everyone thinks." "That doesn't make it true." "No," Don agreed, "but it makes it powerful." Rebecca turned toward him. "You care too much about opinions." Don met her gaze, voice steady but firm. "I care about my name." The words landed harder than either expected. Rebecca had built a life where her name commanded respect regardless of rumor. Don was still building his. The difference mattered more than either of them had fully acknowledged. That night, alone in their separate spaces, both wrestled with frustration. Rebecca resented the world for intruding, yet refused to change her approach. Don resented the silence that allowed assumptions to thrive, yet refused to demand defense. Between them, something strained. The label refused to die. And as it tightened its grip, it began to test not just how the world saw them, but how they saw each other. Distance did not arrive loudly. It slipped in the way fog does, slow, quiet, almost polite, until everything familiar felt just out of reach. Don was the first to create it. He didn't announce a change or ask for space. He simply began rearranging himself within Rebecca's world. He adjusted his schedule to avoid overlapping too closely with hers. He delegated tasks he once handled personally. He stopped lingering after meetings, stopped initiating conversations that drifted beyond work. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing was wrong. To Rebecca, everything felt different. She noticed it in small ways at first. Don no longer challenged her thinking as openly during strategy sessions. He agreed more, spoke less. The ease that once marked their exchanges hardened into professionalism, so strict it felt rehearsed. She told herself it was maturity, growth, adaptation. But the silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Don's decision was not impulsive. It had formed over sleepless nights and long internal arguments. He had weighed pride against opportunity, dignity against proximity, and every time the same conclusion emerged. He could not become a footnote in someone else's story. He wanted to build something of his own, something undeniable, something that belonged to him regardless of who stood beside him. And as long as the world saw him through Rebecca Push, his efforts would remain suspect. That truth cut deeper than gossip ever had. So he chose restraint. He focused on outcomes, on performance, on delivering excellence so consistent it left no room for dismissal. Yet the more he succeeded, the more he felt an ache he refused to name. Rebecca watched this transformation with growing unease. She had always respected independence. She admired ambition, but Dawn's withdrawal felt personal, even if she couldn't articulate why. It stirred a familiar irritation, one she recognized from past relationships that had ended not with conflict but with quiet detachment. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she called him into her office. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. Dawn complied, posture straight, expression unreadable. "You've changed," she said without preamble. Dawn held her gaze. "I've adjusted." "That's not the same thing." "It is when necessary." Rebecca leaned back, studying him. "Necessary for what?" "For clarity," he replied. Her jaw tightened slightly. "You think there wasn't clarity before?" "There was comfort," Dawn said carefully. "Comfort can be misleading." The words stung more than Rebecca expected. She stood, walking toward the window, arms crossed. "You're implying something." "I'm stating reality," Dawn said. "The perception around us isn't neutral. I need to create space between who I am and what people assume." "And you think distance fixes that?" "It gives me control." Rebecca turned back toward him, frustration surfacing. "Control over what? How strangers talk." "Over how I see myself," Dawn said. The room fell quiet. Rebecca had faced confrontations far harsher than this, but this one unsettled her. She had always believed strength meant standing firm, unbothered by noise. Dawn's approach challenged that philosophy. "You don't need to disappear to be respected," she said. "I do if my presence costs me credibility," Dawn replied. She exhaled sharply. "You think I don't understand what that's like?" "I think you outgrew it," Dawn said. "I haven't." The honesty between them was sharp, cutting through layers they had carefully maintained. Rebecca returned to her desk, fingers resting against the surface. "So what is it you're asking for?" "I'm not asking," Dawn said quietly. "I'm deciding." The words landed with finality. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I'll continue my work at the highest standard. Nothing changes professionally." "And personally?" Rebecca asked. Dawn hesitated. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty flickered across his face. "Personally," he said, "I need distance." Rebecca nodded slowly, though something inside her recoiled. "Very well." When he left, the office felt colder. In the days that followed, the space between them solidified. Meetings became strictly agenda-driven. Travel arrangements shifted. Rebecca maintained composure, but the absence of Dawn's presence weighed on her more than she anticipated. She told herself it was irritation. She told herself it was ego. She did not admit it was loss. At night, she replayed their last conversation, dissecting every word. She wondered whether she had misread his intentions from the beginning, whether she had mistaken shared understanding for something deeper. Dawn, meanwhile, threw himself into work with relentless focus. He expanded his network independently, pursued opportunities that had nothing to do with Rebecca's influence, and accepted challenges designed to test him publicly. On paper, it worked. His name began circulating without hers attached. Recognition followed. Invitations arrived. Yet each success felt hollow. Because the distance he had created protected his pride, but starved something else entirely. One night after a particularly long day, Dawn sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights. He thought about Rebecca, about the way she listened, the way she trusted, the way she had once told him he didn't need to prove himself to her. He wondered if he had mistaken protection for rejection. Rebecca, in her penthouse, poured herself a drink she barely touched. She stood by the window, city spread beneath her, and confronted an unfamiliar truth. For all her power, she could not command closeness. Dawn's choice had forced her to face something she avoided her entire life, the risk of needing someone who could walk away. And he had. Pride had drawn the line. Distance had enforced it, and the choice Don made, though rooted in self-preservation, had opened a fracture neither of them knew how to close. For the first time since they met, the future between them felt uncertain. The unraveling did not happen in public. It never did. It began in the quiet, where defenses were weakest and memory had room to breathe. Don had always believed silence was safer than explanation. Words, once released, could be reshaped by others. Stories, once shared, could be used as weapons. So he learned to keep his past folded neatly inside himself, revealing only what was necessary to move forward. But distance had a way of loosening what was tightly bound. The night everything finally broke open began without drama. Don had just returned from a late meeting across town, one that should have felt like progress. The room he entered was dim, unfamiliar despite being his own. He set his jacket down carefully, loosened his tie, and stood still for a moment longer than usual. For the first time since creating space between himself and Rebecca, he felt the full weight of what that decision had cost him. Not opportunity, not reputation. Connection. He reached for his phone without thinking, then stopped. There was no message to send, no conversation to resume. The silence he had chosen now echoed back at him, unforgiving. Across the city, Rebecca Push sat in her study, papers spread across a desk she hadn't touched in hours. She had tried to lose herself in work, but the numbers refused to hold her attention. Everything felt louder lately, the ticking clock, the hum of the building, her own thoughts. She had always prided herself on emotional control. It was what allowed her to survive spaces where vulnerability was treated as liability, but control offered no comfort now. She thought about Don constantly. Not with longing, exactly, but with a kind of unsettled concern. She replayed their last conversation again and again, hearing the finality in his voice, the resolve that had shut her out without cruelty. What disturbed her most was not his withdrawal, but her reaction to it. She missed him. The realization was sharp enough to demand honesty. Rebecca had built her life around certainty. This, whatever it was, offered none, and yet she couldn't ignore it. 2 days later, circumstances forced their paths to cross. A major project required final approval, one Don had overseen independently. Rebecca requested a private review, expecting efficiency and little else. When Don arrived, he looked the same, composed, focused, but something beneath the surface had shifted. He was tired. Not physically, emotionally. They reviewed documents in silence. The air between them was heavy, unresolved. When the work was done, Rebecca closed the folder and looked at him directly. "You're burning yourself out," she said. Don didn't deflect. "It's temporary." That's what people say when they don't plan to stop. He met her gaze. "Why does it matter?" The question wasn't confrontational. It was genuine. Rebecca paused. She could have answered professionally. She could have redirected. Instead, she chose truth. "Because I don't like watching you disappear." The word surprised them both. Don inhaled slowly. For a moment he seemed to weigh something internal, an argument long postponed. "This was never about you," he said quietly. Rebecca remained still. "Then help me understand." Silence stretched. Don turned toward the window, eyes fixed on the city beyond. When he spoke again, his voice carried a restraint that suggested years of practice. "I grew up learning that dependence is dangerous," he said. "Not because people fail you intentionally, but because circumstances change, promises break, control disappears." Rebecca listened without interruption. "I watched people lose everything because they trusted the wrong stability," Don continued. "I learned early that dignity comes from standing alone, from knowing that if everything falls apart, you can still survive without owing anyone." He turned back to her then. "So when the world decided who I was, it wasn't just insulting. It threatened something fundamental." Rebecca's chest tightened. "I didn't want to be seen as someone who traded himself for comfort," Don said. "I didn't want my work, my value, my future questioned because of who I stood beside." "Even if that person never asked you to give up anything?" Rebecca asked softly. "Especially then," Don replied, "because that made it harder to explain." The room felt smaller. Rebecca absorbed his words slowly, understanding crystallizing in ways she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was survival shaped by history she had never asked him to share. "I thought distance would protect us both," Don said. "I didn't realize how much it would hurt." Rebecca exhaled, something fragile loosening inside her. "You should have told me," she said. Don shook his head. "I didn't know how to without sounding ungrateful." "Gratitude isn't silence," Rebecca replied, "and dignity doesn't require isolation." She stood, closing the space between them, not touching but present. "I never saw you as dependent," she said. "I saw you as capable, intentional, equal in the ways that mattered." Don looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since they met, he let the guard fall. "I didn't believe I could be both," he admitted. Rebecca's voice softened. "You can." The admission settled between them, heavy but grounding. In that moment, Rebecca understood something fundamental. Don had never been running from her. He had been running from a version of himself he feared becoming. And Don understood something equally important. Rebecca had never tried to own him. She had only offered space. They didn't resolve everything that day. There were still consequences to navigate, perceptions to dismantle, wounds to tend. But something essential shifted. The truth Don had been hiding no longer sat between them like a barrier. It became a bridge. And for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone in the crossing. The city had never felt so loud. Lights flickered, cameras clicked, and whispers moved faster than traffic, but Rebecca Push refused to retreat. She had spent decades learning that survival required discretion. She had built empires behind closed doors, conquered rivals with silent strategy, and carried her power as a shield against judgment. Yet here, with Don at her side, discretion no longer felt sufficient. It began with a photograph. One that captured them leaving a private event together, Don walking slightly ahead, posture calm, face composed, and Rebecca following with her signature elegance. Nothing provocative, nothing romantic by the world's standards. Yet the internet exploded. Gossip outlets ran headlines dripping with implication. Billionaire Rebecca pushes young companion, romance or arrangement. Don saw the headlines first. He scrolled in silence, thumb frozen over the screen. He had anticipated speculation, but not the tone, not the insinuation that reduced him to a label he had worked his life to escape. Rebecca, on the other hand, didn't panic. She didn't call PR teams or draft statements. She didn't adjust her schedule or force Don to avoid public spaces. She simply called him. "Meet me," she said, no hesitation, no explanation. Don arrived at her office, expecting a measured discussion. Instead, she led him straight to the rooftop terrace, overlooking the skyline shimmering like liquid gold. The wind carried the faint hum of the city, but the space between them felt sacred. "They're attacking you," Don said quietly. "They're defining you before anyone sees who you really are." Rebecca didn't flinch. "Let them." Don frowned. "Let them, they'll ruin your reputation, mine too." Rebecca's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "You don't understand. I've spent my life bending to the narrative of others, hiding truth to appease judgment. Not anymore. If they want a story, they can have it, but the one that matters is ours." Her words struck him like lightning. He had spent weeks building walls, distancing himself, guarding every ounce of pride he had. And yet here she stood, choosing to face the fire openly, choosing him openly, without compromise. He swallowed, feeling the tension between pride and relief war within him. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "You're not a label, Don. You're not a story for them to write. You're someone I chose, and I'm standing with you whether they approve or not." The conviction in her voice changed something in him. Pride, which had felt like armor, suddenly felt like weight. He realized that love, real love, required more than careful calculation. It required courage. It required the willingness to be seen when the world wanted to misinterpret every gesture. "Then we do this," he said finally, "together." Rebecca reached out, brushing his sleeve lightly, a gesture unremarkable to anyone else but monumental to them. "Together," she repeated. In the days that followed, they faced the scrutiny of the world like a storm they had decided to walk through hand in hand. Public appearances no longer required pretense. Private interactions no longer required caution. Every conversation in the media, every pointed comment online, every whisper from colleagues or investors was met with calm certainty. Don spoke at a corporate dinner for the first time, not as someone attached to Rebecca, not as a young companion, but as a partner in thought. His words were measured, intelligent, and undeniable. The room shifted, noticing the confidence that came not from her shadow but from within him. Rebecca, meanwhile, stood by his side without flinching. She no longer smoothed over assumptions. She no longer allowed apologies for proximity. She presented them as a unit, equal, deliberate, intentional. The fire of public opinion raged, but it could not touch them. Not because they ignored it, but because they had chosen each other over it. One evening, after an especially grueling press event, they returned to her penthouse in silence. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent and infinite. Don poured them both glasses of wine. "You made a choice," he said, looking at her with a mixture of awe and something softer, almost tender. "I made the only choice I could," she replied, "one I won't regret." He nodded, understanding fully. Standing in the fire together wasn't about denying challenge or danger. It was about refusing to let the fire define them. And for the first time, both of them felt the weight of the world lessen, not because it had changed, but because they had chosen a stance that refused to bow. The night stretched into quiet conversation, laughter that had been absent for weeks, and the knowledge that they could face anything as long as they faced it together. The world still watched, it still whispered, it still labeled. But Rebecca and Don no longer cared. They had become untouchable, not because they hid, but because they refused to run. They had chosen each other. And that choice, they knew, would change everything. The moment arrived not in a grand gesture, but in quiet honesty, a confession stripped of drama, stripped of pretense, stripped of everything except truth. They had returned from an awards gala, late at night, the city lights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Rebecca's penthouse. The world outside still murmured, still speculated, but inside the air was different, heavy with something that had been building for weeks. Don sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. Rebecca stood near the window, a glass of wine untouched in her hand, watching the reflections of the skyline ripple across the floor. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I need to say this," Don began finally, voice low but firm. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if searching for permission to drop every last guard he had held for so long. "And I need you to hear it without twisting it into something it is." Rebecca's pulse quickened slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. She had felt this coming, sensed it in his quiet gaze and the weight in his silence, but hearing him begin made it real. "You've been patient with me in ways no one has ever been," he continued, voice breaking just slightly. "Patient when I kept walls up, patient when I pulled away, patient when I refused to let anyone, including you, see what really drives me. And he paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been terrified of losing you because I never wanted my past, my mistakes, my pride to make you doubt me." Rebecca took a small step closer, silent, waiting. "I need you to know this," he said, lifting his gaze fully to meet hers. "You are not my sugar mommy. You are not an opportunity. You are not a stepping stone. You are not anyone I owe anything to for survival or comfort." His words hung in the air, heavy and electric. Rebecca felt it resonate deep in her chest, uncoiling the tension she hadn't even realized she had been holding. "I am here for you," Don said, voice cracking with emotion he had long restrained. "Because I want to be, because I choose to be, not for money, not for convenience, not because the world tells me it's expected. I'm here because you are the love of my life." The words landed between them, a declaration so simple yet so profound that the penthouse seemed to shrink to the space between them. The city outside, the whispers, the headlines, all of it faded. Rebecca blinked once, then twice, and the walls around her heart she hadn't intended to lower began to crumble. She had built empires, faced rivals, and endured the harshest criticism. But this, the honesty in his voice, the raw truth in his eyes, struck deeper than any negotiation or victory. "Don," she whispered, voice trembling in a way she had never allowed herself in public. I thought you didn't want to be tied down by me, by this world, by all of this." He shook his head. "I don't want to be tied down by anyone, but I want to be with you. That's the difference. I've spent my life proving I can stand alone, survive, and be enough for myself. And now," he reached out tentatively, fingertips brushing against hers, "I don't want to stand alone, not when it comes to you." Rebecca let herself finally step forward, closing the distance. She allowed her hand to rest over his. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe even years, she let herself feel, not the weight of control, not the fear of judgment, but pure, unguarded connection. You're not just saying this to make me feel better?" she asked, voice raw. "No," he said simply, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." A silence followed, but it was different now. It wasn't the kind that created distance. It was a silence of understanding, of two people who had finally dismantled walls and reached the truth beneath. Rebecca smiled, small at first, then broader, more certain. "Then we do this on our own terms." Don nodded, a smile breaking through the seriousness that had defined him for so long. "On our terms. No labels, no assumptions, just us." And in that quiet penthouse, surrounded by the city that never slept, the words they had longed to hear but hadn't dared to speak finally existed. Honesty, choice, love. For Don, it was freedom from a world that had refused to see him fully. For Rebecca, it was the revelation that trust and love could exist even when the world demanded control. Together it became the turning point, the moment that redefined everything, solidifying the bond that no gossip, no judgment, no assumption could touch. They were no longer defined by rumor, they were defined by each other. And in that moment the power dynamic shifted. It no longer belonged to wealth or age. It belonged to love, raw and undeniable. Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Rebecca's penthouse, brushing the city in gold. It was quiet, almost impossibly so, as if the world had granted them a brief reprieve from judgment, gossip, and expectation. For the first time in months, the air between Rebecca Push and Don was free, free of labels, free of doubt, free of the relentless pressure that had defined their connection for so long. They sat together on the edge of her sofa, coffee cups steaming in their hands. Neither spoke immediately. Words had been said, weighty, life-altering words, and both knew that what came next was less about conversation and more about presence. Don looked at her, eyes steady, unwavering. There was no performance, no shield, just him, just honesty, just intention. Rebecca studied him, recognizing the lines of fatigue softened by trust, the tension of pride finally easing. She reached out, letting her fingers brush against his hand, a small touch that carried volumes. "You're really here," she whispered. "I've always been here," Don replied softly. "I just needed you to see me for who I am, not for who the world thinks I should be." Rebecca smiled, A smile unburdened and uncalculated, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in public for years. "And now you know I see you." "Yes," he said, voice gentle, "completely, and I choose to stay. Not because it's easy, not because anyone expects it, but because I want to." She squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of everything they had survived. The whispers, the rumors, the labels, the prideful distance, the fear of losing each other. All of it had led to this clarity. They belonged together, not because circumstances demanded it, but because they chose it. "And I choose you," Rebecca said, her voice unwavering now. "Every day, age, wealth, gossip, they don't define us, we define us." Don let out a quiet laugh, soft and relieved. "Finally," he said. "No pretending, no walls, no fear of misjudgment, just us." For a moment they sat like that, letting the city hum beneath them, the sunlight washing over their shared space. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Ordinary because life continued beyond these walls. Extraordinary because for the first time both had found safety in each other without compromise. The world still existed outside. There would be comments, speculation, and people ready to dissect their every move. But now it no longer mattered. They had reclaimed the narrative. They had stripped it down to its essence: choice, truth, and love. Rebecca rested her head lightly against Don's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, not possessively but protectively. Not because she needed protection, but because they were equal partners navigating life together, their strengths intertwined. "You know," Rebecca murmured, "this doesn't feel like fear anymore." "No," Don agreed. "It feels like freedom, the kind that comes from being seen and accepted fully." They didn't need to speak of the past anymore. They didn't need to justify their connection. There was no explanation required, no approval to earn. What they had, authentic, honest, and intentional, was enough. In the weeks that followed, they moved through life on their own terms. Public appearances were shared with quiet confidence rather than cautious concealment. Conversations with friends and colleagues were rooted in respect, not rumor management. And at every turn, they reaffirmed the choice they had made: each other. Don thrived not because Rebecca had elevated him, but because she had seen him, acknowledged him, and allowed him the space to rise. Rebecca flourished not because she controlled perception, but because she loved without compromise, without fear, without apology. Together, they discovered a rhythm that neither had expected but both desperately needed. A balance between ambition and intimacy, independence and partnership, public scrutiny and private truth. And in that balance they found joy, real joy, unhurried, unshadowed. For Don and Rebecca, love was no longer defined by age, wealth, or expectation. It was defined by choice, by trust, by the courage to stand together in a world determined to impose labels they refused to accept. They had survived whispers, rumors, and prideful distance. They had faced fire together and chosen honesty over pretense. And now, finally, they could simply be, seen, heard, and loved on their own terms. As the sun fully rose over New York, spilling golden light into the penthouse, Don and Rebecca sat side by side, holding hands, and smiled. Not because the world had accepted them, not because the story had concluded, but because they had written their own story, one that belonged entirely to them. Theirs was not perfection, it was something better, real, chosen, and unbreakable. The city waited outside, full of noise and judgment, but inside, Rebecca and Don finally understood what mattered. Each other entirely, without compromise, without apology, without fear. And for the first time, they were completely free.